Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to SETA DC. We have yet another panel on Turkey-US relations on Syria. I don't know, probably this is the 10th panel on Turkey-US relations in Syria in the last couple of years. It has been one of the most significant bottlenecks in the relations, and in terms of the strategic relations between US and Turkey, Syria has become one of the most significant irritants in the last couple of years. It started with the tactical divergence on the ground, then it led to, especially after the emergence of ISIS, the US support to YPG has become the biggest source of crisis in bilateral relations. And now, after the withdrawal decision of President Trump, we came to a critical juncture again. And considering the different issues in Turkey-US relations, especially the looming S-400 crisis, we have been seeing that the withdrawal of US from Syria, and especially negotiations on the safe zone, can become actually a bright side of the Turkish-American relations now. And today we have two panelists to discuss the trajectory of US-Turkey relations in Syria, and maybe on other issues as well. We have Rich Outzen, Senior Advisor for Syria Engagement from State Department, and we have Burhanettin Duran, General Coordinator of the SETA Foundation. So we will start with Rich today, and we will ask him to give a brief overview of the state of the negotiations on the safe zone and Syria between US and Turkey. And he just arrived actually last night from Turkey, so he will have some fresh insights about that.
Okay, thank you very much. It's good to be here again, especially sharing the stage with my distinguished colleague, Burhanettin, who, of course, runs SETA more generally. We work here pretty frequently with the DC office, and it's always a pleasure intellectually and an honor personally to be able to work with you here, but also especially with Burhanettin, who's such an important piece on the Turkish side of understanding and conceptualizing US-Turkey relations. So my big news from Turkey is that the Mediterranean is swimmable at this time of year. I was in Antalya actually to join in a NATO Parliamentary Assembly conference in which we had representatives from all the NATO countries and a number of observer countries visiting as well. And it's sort of refreshing actually to be before I get to just the Syria piece of this, to be in an atmosphere with others who are vested in the US-Turkey relationship, because all of NATO wants US-Turkey relations to work. And I see a friend from the Greek embassy. I shared a car with one of the Greek parliamentarians, and we were talking about that as well. She was on her way back to Thessaloniki. And there's no one who wants to see a failure of US-Turkey cooperation on Syria, or more generally in the relationship. Of course, we are in a pretty tense time with regards to bilateral relations, and I suppose we'll talk about that as our hour goes on. The piece that I work on, of course, is primarily on Syria, and I do want to make that distinction clear right up front, that we have a European bureau in the State Department that does the broader relationship. I'm thankful for that. Ambassador Jeffrey, James Jeffrey, who's a former ambassador to Turkey, former Deputy National Security Advisor, and my boss are focusing on Syria writ large. My office is also responsible for the de-ISIS coalition, what used to be called SECI. Now we're one office. It's SRS SECI with Ambassador Jeffrey on top of both organizations. And I think this is actually a good thing, this organizational change, because it reflects the reality that the nature of our struggle against ISIS, which has dominated Syria policy for several years now, is changing in some subtle ways now that we've seen the end of the physical caliphate. And again, I'll touch on that in just a moment. But I do want to give my regards on, or pass regards on from Ambassador Jeffrey, who was heading out for travel this afternoon. He was speaking at the American Turkish Council's annual meetings this morning on very similar topics to what we're discussing here today. It is somewhat ironic, having watched the US and Turkey struggle with how to coordinate policy on Syria for the last several years, to note that perhaps it is turning from one of the big weak spots of the relationship to potentially something that can be an important sort of pillar of cooperation moving forward regionally. And I'll get to that in a little bit more detail in just a bit. I do want to take a moment to say that both for the U.S. and for Turkey and the rest of the countries that are represented in our coalition fighting against ISIS, that it is a major, major milestone with the end of the fighting in Bahus, or at least the dissolution of the last territory held by ISIS in Bahus a couple of weeks ago, that we have reached sort of a major milestone, and it gives us an opportunity to reassess where we're at. For a couple of different reasons, this very, very complicated set of problems that is represented by the Syrian conflict has been hard for either the U.S. or Turkey to get a single coherent policy in place on for the last several years. We've had many different aspects to our policy, some related to Assad, especially early on, the Assad must go sort of approach, the support to the armed opposition. We've had concerns over chemical weapons proliferation and taken military action on several occasions against the chemical weapons use and capabilities of the Assad regime. We've had very deep concerns about Iran's growing instrumentalization of the Syrian state and the threat that that poses not just to Syrian sovereignty, but also to many of the neighbors of Syria. And of course, the one that really got our attention starting in 2014 was the rise of ISIS from sort of a one terrorist group among many in and around Syria and Iraq to being a unique global threat that was almost cartoonishly evil and a direct threat to the U.S. homeland as well as to European countries. And for understandable reasons, that sort of seized the agenda in Washington and became the main pillar of our policy. That, in turn, led to the relationship with the YPG, the Syrian militia associated with the PKK, which is the backbone of the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces. One positive in the relationship, and one of the things that has been, although not particularly gratifying, I guess satisfying in a sense, is that we've gotten beyond the point at which we talk about sort of, why would you do that? Well, we're not really doing that level of conversation. I think it's known that we use that relationship with the YPG as a tool in the fight against ISIS. And when we meet with our Turkish counterparts, the hemming and the hawing about that and temporizing, I think that part's done. Now we're talking about what to do about it. And the safe zone is which again I'll get to in just a minute, is a very concrete and I think constructive dialogue about how to address that and the threats, the secondary threats that has raised for Turkey as we have pursued our de-ISIS strategy. So the U.S. policy on the resolution of the conflict at the top level is unchanged. I know that what's grabbed the headlines in the recent months has not been just the end of the territorial caliphate, but also President Trump's decision that we will withdraw U.S. troops from Syria. I want to emphasize that the withdrawal of troops represents a change of operational mode. We never hung the entirety of our Syria policy, such as it was, on the presence of U.S. ground troops. They were there for a very specific purpose. Now, those of us that have been working Syria policy tried to leverage that purpose for some other uses in terms of supporting the broader regional policy, but we were very clear. The only authorization for our troops to be on the ground in Syria was related to defeating ISIS, and that remains the case. So, of course, ISIS still retains operational capability. It no longer controls ground. We can't say it's a state or a quasi-state anymore because it no longer controls territory, but it remains a very capable and sophisticated terror threat, certainly more so than al-Qaeda at this stage. And those of us who remember what happened when we defeated the ISIS forerunner in Iraq, al-Qaeda in Iraq, in the surge of 2006 and 7 and 8 in Iraq, and then we withdrew too quickly as we got into the 2009 and 2010 period, allowing space for a resurgence of this group. Certainly want to be very careful about how we manage the withdrawal of U.S. troops so as not to repeat that experience. But I do want to emphasize that the U.S. policy is, first of all, that we are going to withdraw those troops. Now, the modalities of how quickly that happens and what exactly we're doing in the wake of it, how much support we get from the international coalition to do the de-ISIS residual mission that will survive the departure of our troops, and what sort of things we can do regionally, those are all things that we're working on, and the safe zone plays a big role in that. If we make the safe zone work properly and consensually between the United States and Turkey without creating a new conflagration there, then in fact we have a much greater chance of having allied buy-in, coalition buy-in for maintaining some residual presence. There are a number of tasks related to stabilization in the wake of ISIS's territorial defeat that have to be done and will take months, if not years, to do. So I want to make that point fairly early in the presentation, that the United States is not leaving Syria in terms of our policy. We are withdrawing some ground troops. That's one tool of many that we have in terms of how we affect the situation on the ground in Syria. To put some simple numbers on the policy as it existed both before the decision on ground troops and now, I want to just recommend that you think in terms of 5, 3, and 6. 5 is the 5 militaries other than the Syrian Arab army that are currently occupying or operating in portions of Syria. This changes the nature of the campaign. There are many who say the war is over, the opposition has lost. Well, on the ground, the armed opposition can be said to have lost if we conceive of this as a sort of binary struggle between opposition and regime in which the goal is regime change. I think everybody realizes the armed opposition is not going to displace Assad. Yet there are elements of the armed opposition that are still functioning and controlling, in conjunction, in some cases with Turkey, parts of Syrian territory. In addition to that, leaving aside that dichotomous war, Russia, Iran, the United States, Turkey, and Israel all either control parts on the ground or over the air of Syrian airspace. As a matter of fact, the Assad regime controls, I think, about 60% of the territory, and even that it controls very weakly and is not functioning in the ways that we would expect a normal state to function. So to that extent, it's wrong to think of the war as being over. The 5 armies means it's not done. And each of the armies that are there, in context of their national policy, have good reasons to stay. Obviously, we don't support them all staying. The presence of Iranian troops and militias supported by Iran is actually very much one of the reasons that we are intent on not letting the current status quo become the enduring status quo. But that said, the Iranians are committed to stay there. They have what they consider to be strategic reasons for doing so, as do the Russians. But the presence of these 5 armies also creates something of a stalemate, because none of these are low-hanging fruit. It's not going to be easy for the regime or anyone else to pluck any of these off. And frankly, even as the number of troops that we have on the ground goes down, the significant function of U.S. air presence as we do de-ISIS stabilization east of the Euphrates is something not to be trifled with. And I think that the regime and other actors in Syria have seen that. So we still maintain that. Turkey will not easily be displaced until they have a political solution in Syria that is acceptable to them. So anyway, this war is far from over in that regard. And there's no easy military solution to it. What there is a need for a political solution to that. In the second number, the 3, that has to do with the conditions that the United States holds to be important for us to actually say that this war is over and has moved to a different stage, sort of normalization and reconstruction and so forth. The first of those is the enduring defeat of ISIS. This war is not done, and we're not ready for sort of a new and normal set of relationships in and around Syria until we can say the de-ISIS fight has been stabilized, not just the territorial caliphate done. There is the withdrawal, the second piece of that, of the Iranian-controlled forces and militias from Syria, because that will represent the restoration of Syrian sovereignty and the somewhat normal function of control. And then there needs to be a political resolution in accordance with 2254. That is, to avoid the Syrian conflict from becoming a frozen conflict, the only way out is through a negotiated political solution. We have had several years of people saying Geneva's dead, Geneva's not working, 2254 is not working. But there is no replacement for 2254 because it is a unique statement that even the Russians bought into about the nature of the international community's interest in and role in resolution of the conflict. And the constitutional reform and the elections that will be the fruits of a successful 2254 effort are the only way that we can take this very broken, fractured situation in Syria and get back to something that looks like normal resolution. I want to be very clear, the United States will not support the reconstruction of Syria under current management absent a 2254 process. We are strong on that point. The Russians cannot, and I would assume don't want to, on their own, finance reconstruction of Syria. I really don't think they can. For both Russia and for Iran, the total subsidy and support of the Syrian economy is going to be an increasing burden. Believe me, there are many in Europe, in the Gulf, and even the United States who want to see Syria reconstructed. But it cannot be reconstructed until the other 3 conditions are met, and that has not changed. That is still very much a part of our policy. So the last of these three numbers is the six. The six key criteria for Syria resuming a normal place in sort of the regional order and in international relations and resumption of some sort of relationship with the United States. And I want to be very explicit. We are not after regime change in Syria. We are after a change in regime behavior in Syria. And the fact that the regime has done everything that it has done over the 6 years since the Syrian revolution started should show anybody who knows the political cultures of the United States and Europe that this cannot stand. We cannot simply re-engage with an unreformed Syrian regime. The six conditions that a reformed regime would have to put into place in order to resume healthy relations with the West and maybe unlock reconstruction funding would include that Syria would have to pose no threat to its neighbors, provide no support to terrorism, abjure in a verifiable way chemical weapons and all other weapons of mass destruction, not be under Iranian control, would have to facilitate accountability for the crimes committed during the war, and arrange for the safe, voluntary, and dignified return of refugees. It's a heavy lift, but these are, again, unchanged. So if any of those who think that America is not still on the policy of which all of these conditions are part, the whole 536 is a recognition of that. That is the policy. That is the strategy. How we do it, it's going to evolve over time, but having 2,000 or so ground troops on the ground east of the Euphrates does not have to be part of the toolkit as it has existed over the past 2.5 years in order for us to pursue those things. Until those conditions are met, the international community rightly should view Syria as a broken and dysfunctional shell of a state that cannot protect its own people and must, in order to restore legitimacy with the vast majority of those people, make significant changes. Millions of Syrians live as refugees outside the country or within areas outside regime control, and it would simply be irresponsible for countries to press for normalization absent the focused process to get those six conditions in. So Assad may have regained control of half of Syria, but he cannot rebuild that half nor seize what remains as long as the coalition seeks to stabilize it and works against the continued threat of ISIS. And the sponsors who have allowed an unrepentant Assad to torture his country will foot a mounting bill in the shell of a state until a real political solution is found. So I'd also like to say we're encouraged by the efforts of Geir Peterson, the new UN Special Envoy for Syria. The commitment and resolve of our European partners and of Turkey has been notable in this regard. There's a lot of overlap between the United States and the Turkish position on Syria, and I think in the end what we want is the same. There is a very serious obstacle in terms of this issue about the Northeast to be resolved until we get there. But constantly when we talk about Syria, things like Turkey's role in Idlib and stabilizing Idlib, and we want to stop short of explicitly endorsing your cooperation with the Russians in this regard, but we're not really talking to them about this sort of thing. So I would say it's a good thing that Turkey has worked to avoid a massive new Russian and regime military operation against Idlib that would create all sorts of humanitarian pressures and atrocities, most likely. So in regards to the endgame diplomacy, in regards to Idlib, in regards to checking Iranian hegemony and instrumentalization of the Syrian state, the United States and Turkey are on board with one another on all of these things. And of course, Turkey's hosting 3.6 million Syrian refugees and all the work that it's done to ameliorate the human impacts of this war, things that the United States should not and I think will not forget. All of that said, I think the elephant in the room is what happens in the Northeast. Again, I don't want to waste any time in the back and forth between you shouldn't have used the YPG, don't you know the YPG is PKK, why'd you do that? That's water under the bridge. The issue now here is we have a situation where the Northeast is reasonably stable in some regards. There's what I would consider to be progress that needs to be made in making sure that the governance, interim governance, and security institutions in that area, I won't even say institutions, the arrangements, are currently not as they should be. They're not fully representative of all the communities of Northeast Syria. And so, for instance, local security forces in predominantly Arab areas should be predominantly Arab. That's a principle I think that the United States and Turkey both ascribe to. Not only that, Turkey has a very strong and very reasonable, I think, objection to YPG forces being along its border. For anyone who studied the history of the border area and the relationship of YPG to PKK and the evolution of the PKK campaign against Turkey over the years, I think would have to have some sympathy for that argument. But the question then becomes, does Turkey, in order to solve that problem that it perceives, does it have to launch a major new unilateral military operation in order to clear the YPG off the border? I don't think that's necessary. And I think this safe zone idea that the presidents on both sides have articulated, and that we've been involved in very detailed and serious talks about how to detail implementation for it over the past 2 to 3 months, is the solution for that. Because if we have the safe zone implemented in the right way, we will get YPG off the border. There will be a removal of military fortifications that are considered threatening by Turkey. Heavy weapons and heavy equipment, those sorts of things would be removed as well. There'd be strong verification mechanisms jointly coordinated by the United States and Turkey to ensure that these things remain the same. And then there would be a process by which, I'll say the interim governance again. I say interim, I want to make this point explicitly, because ultimately the United States and Turkey, I think, tell me if I get this wrong, Burhanettin, when you speak, both want to see this area become integrated with the Syrian state as a result of the 2254 process. None of us want to see, there's no new Sykes-Picot, we don't have any napkins or maps where we're drawing lines for a permanent new border. We want a healthy, unified, reasonably democratic Syrian state. And we want the people of the Northeast, all of them, Arab, Kurd, Turkmen, Christian, other Yazidis, whoever else is there, we want them to have democratic rights, and we want them to live securely. The question now is how to get there. A safe zone that meets Turkey's security requirements and allows local security forces and local governance to develop without a whole new conflagration would be a huge win in terms of that type of stabilization. Now, there are questions that can be raised about, do we have the intent to stay long enough to see this through? Are we willing to commit resources to help stabilization activities? Do the Europeans trust that the United States and Turkey will not be at each other's throats in the Northeast, but they can trust both as good partners that will stay and help stabilize that area? If these things all are answered in the affirmative, then I think the safe zone will become a success story of 2019 and 2020. And I think we all know there will be no storybook ending to the Syrian conflict. The diplomacy that we're all involved in now is making sure we avoid worst outcomes. I would say, from the perspective of Ambassador Jeffrey's team, since August of last year, we've had some success in avoiding worst outcomes. Idlib has not been overrun by the regime. We've not seen a new round of chemical weapons attacks. We do not have a major new conflict involving Kurds and Turks in the Northeast. We've not seen the interim arrangements together east of the Euphrates unravel, and the United States has not abruptly pulled out. These are all important things, and I think reasons for hope. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. There are still very different ways in which the Turkish view of the safe zone and the American view of the safe zone diverge. But the question is not, is there divergence? The question is there enough convergence to have a working arrangement? And I for one, am confident on that. And I don't want to overtalk, so why don't we turn it back over.
Thank you, Rich. Burhanettin, Turkey's position of this on the recent negotiations on Syria and Turkey, and where are we right now according to Turkey?
Thank you, Kilic. I'm actually one more time honored to be at SETA DC for a panel on challenges to US-Turkey cooperation on Syria. But I also share the same idea with Kilic and my friend Rich Outzen that Syria can be a topic of cooperation between Turkey and US after so many tensions between two countries in the last 7 years. It is ironic to see that it was Syria that created many problems between Washington and Ankara. But we have reached to the point that we have other problems. So Syria can be a positive field for cooperation. But of course, we have to put this issue, Syria, in the context of in the broader context of Turkish-American relations. We should start by recognizing that our relations are reshaped in a changing environment. The international setting and the strategic calculations of all powers, including US and Turkey, are transforming, and all of the issues are put in the table to reconsider what are the national security interests. For the US, this is maybe the redefinition of US role in all over the world, US leadership in the world. For Turkey, this is much more challenging because international and regional environment are presenting many challenges to Turkish foreign policy decision makers. This is not just YPG or Daesh or two civil wars in the neighborhood, but also the changing strategic dynamics and power of balances in the Middle East and even in the surrounding region of Turkey. So all of the issues in bilateral terms have to be understood in such a changing national security, national interest understandings between Washington and Ankara. Of course, this is not an easy job to do because the nature of the relationship has to be redefined because we are very, very far away from the good old days of strategic partnership. So we have to be realistic and we have to recognize what kind of tensions we have. Yes, also I share the idea that Turkish-US relations could be based still on the convergences rather than divergences. But just looking at Syria easily, we can see that this even needs more strong coordination and strong will to do that. Since 2013, we are discussing so much during the Obama administration and now Trump administration. We are so much discussing the future of US-Turkey cooperation on Syria. But until now, actually, we have we are not at the position that we want to be. You know, we have Manbij roadmap, but still with the delay. And again, the last decision that a US administration put on the agenda of the world, that is the withdrawal from Syria. Even this is not a clear-cut policy. Yes, Rich tried to make it more clear, but still, when this withdrawal is and what are the parameters that can be fulfilled by the US in Syria while withdrawing. Actually, these are ambitious goals to be fulfilled while withdrawing from Syria, just to fight with Daesh and preventing Iran and militias being dominant in Syria and protecting Turkey's security on the border and many other issues. So it is not easy to fulfill all of them in Syria. I should admit that from the beginning. For Turkey, in Syria, we faced some periods of challenges. It was different in 2013, and now it's a different story. Turkey is trying to make it sure that territorial integrity would be saved, and there will be a safe return for refugees to Syria. And of course, clearance of terrorist groups, including YPG and Daesh from the borders, and the territorial integrity, not just in terms of Daesh, but also in terms of YPG should be fulfilled. So all of these goals, of course, are not easy to be realized. But I strongly believe that Syria can be a place of cooperation between Turkey and US. Why? Because Turkey is also committed to 2244-54 decision. And this is the political solution in Syria. Of course, I will not go into the polemics of whether what could be done if Turkey and US could successfully equip and arm moderate groups in Syria. We are far away from this. But now, at least we should be clear on some point that there can be no durable stability with YPG presence in northern Syria. Yes, there is a stability, but this is temporary, and it is not valid for all Syrians. There is no return to YPG-controlled area. So it is not actually, it's not sustainable from a Turkish perspective. Well, to have a safe zone together, working on together, is something that we should, support as academics or as think tankers. Why? Because I want to put this in the broader context. Unfortunately, I could anticipate some more tensions between Washington and Ankara in the coming weeks and months. This is the issue that all of us know about air defense system. Turkey's decision to purchase S-400 missile system from Russia, and I understand that this is becoming more and more emotional issue on the side of Congress to put a pressure on Turkey. But first we should get rid of this emotional background, because this will not help to repair Turkish-US relations. Syria is still a point of a topic of cooperation, but other side of the story is becoming more and more critical. The relations between Ankara and Washington are deteriorating, unfortunately. So we have to make more positive agenda to handle these issues. Something is very clear. Turkey's decision to purchase this air defense system was because of the security problems that Turkey faced after 2013. And Turkey, unfortunately, couldn't find any NATO ally to purchase this system. And Russia was the last resort in that terms. And we have reached to the point that we should not discuss this issue in the context of shift of access or Turkey's choice of any other strategic partnership. I think these are not helping to understand the real situation and the prospects between Turkey and the US. On the contrary, we have to manage this tension to the level that there can be some ground for furthering prospects of cooperation in Syria, in Iran, in the issue of Iran and the East Mediterranean. But when you look at the last developments, for example, in the last week, we witnessed 3 resolutions to the Congress that are actually against Turkey. So we have to change this atmosphere, and I think all of us as Turkey and US have a task to do that, have a responsibility to do that, because our relations, are 7 decades old, and in such an environment, in such a changing environment in the international setting, and in such an environment in the regional turbulence of the Middle East, these tensions could be a problem itself. We have to manage them carefully, and we should not let them to create other problems that will make out of control. So this is the background for Turkish-American diplomacy that they should work. We should be clear about that. I know the divergences, and that's why one of my final remarks on that, before seeing the deep down, there should be something to repair the ground for positive developments between Washington and Ankara. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before opening the floor for questions from the audience, I have several questions to our panelists. First couple of one is for Rich. When you were mentioning the conversation, you said it was a concrete and constructive dialogue. So for the last couple of years, most of these conversations on Syria took place, and following that, the remarks were, the conversation and dialogue were frank and honest, which meant that there are still too many problems to resolve. So does this mean that there are also some improvement in the relation between the actors and negotiators discussing Syria?
It's a good question. To be fair, would have to say that I was not involved prior to August of last year with the discussions. But I think the tone has been very positive, and I think some of the key messages that we're giving are a little bit less at variance with what Turkey perceives to be the truth on the ground. So for instance, as we have moved through the different stages of our de-ISIS campaign in Syria, and we're sort of one of the more frequent refrains or talking points from the American side is the relationship with the YPG is temporary, tactical, and transactional. And Turkey observed at variance with this that we were building local security forces and administrative structures, well, not with the YPG per se. And for the US side, it is a distinction that's important between STC, SDF, and PYD, YPG. But there's certainly huge overlap in those organizations. So Turkey said, what you're telling me, which is this is small, this is unimportant, this is ephemeral, is conflicting with what you're telling us now, which is that or what we see on the ground, which is that you're actually pumping all sorts of resources and making plans to stay for a long time. President Trump's decision very clearly to say, we are going to withdraw our ground presence and we are not going to be shaping any sort of a statelet in the Northeast. This is going to be tied back into 2254 and the resolution, I think clarified a lot. I think one of the things that was more difficult in the conversations that in previous years that we've had between the two sides is in the back of the Turkish mind, collectively, this idea that actually the United States isn't being honest with us, that they have a long-term plan that they're going to implement, and they're simply just not telling us. And that would increase tension and mutual suspicion. I think now they understand that the problem is not that we're planning on doing something that we're going to trick Turkey about. The problem is that this is a very complex problem set, and we only really picked firmly on the counterterrorism aspect to vigorously prosecute. And that's why there were some contradictions in the rest of the apparent policies. Now it's pretty clear. If we're going to draw our ground troops out from Syria, we have to put some things in that are acceptable to Turkey so that Turkey does not feel the need to launch a major unilateral operation, and it has to work for the people in the local region. I mean, if we were in some theoretical world to throw the keys to Turkey and say, yeah, come on in and do whatever you want, that would also probably not be acceptable to most of the people of Northeast Syria, because while Turkey's done some very good work with refugees and I think has good intent with regards to stabilizing the area, it has to be a Syrian-led solution in the Northeast. So that starts to shape sort of a set of conditions that are going to be acceptable to both sides. That has changed the nature of the conversation between us and our Turkish interlocutors. Turkey has very professional military intelligence and diplomatic services, so we've always had correct and proper conversations. But there's an urgency now to this, and an understanding from both sides that we have a finite window to make this work that has produced, I think, a better atmosphere.
Another question, you mentioned military disengagement and withdrawal, but while mentioning that, you multiple times reiterated that there will be continuous diplomatic engagement for the future of Syria. And the 6 policy priorities that you mentioned would be very hard to achieve with a light footprint on the ground. So what would be the balance of diplomatic engagement and military disengagement? Would diplomatic engagement compensate the military withdrawal of United States from Syria?
So as a practical matter, both Turkey and the United States currently are militarily engaged in Syria. So that is a fact that provides us both with some challenges, but also with some opportunities. And I, for one, think the fact that Turkey is, from all appearances, intent on staying in the areas that it's occupied until those areas are stabilized and until there is a political resolution, that's a good thing. The United States has also made very focused outreach to other coalition partners. Because again, we're not saying we want to liquidate coalition military presence east of the Euphrates. What we're saying is a couple of things. First of all, that the United States cannot bear that burden ad infinitum, because we've got other things going on in Afghanistan and other parts of the world. We have an active de-ISIS campaign that will continue globally. So we can't continue to form the bulk of the military forces there. So we do need some others to come through, and some of our European partners are interested, and I can't go into details here except for to say that the tasks of continued counterterrorism and stabilization will have some others that will be involved with it if we can get things, if we can work this issue with Turkey, which is still a very preeminent one.
You mean in the safe zone?
In the safe zone. Well, I don't mean that there will be coalition in the safe zone. I mean, if the United States and Turkey can make the safe zone work, then that opens up the possibility of coalition presence to do the other things that need to be done, excuse me, outside of the safe zone for stabilization and for de-ISIS. So I think the military tool is still going to be there in terms of stabilizing and supporting negotiations. Now, I don't think anybody with military presence right now is considering, again, regime change is not the issue. Nobody's saying we'll force Assad to do X or Y through military means. I think what's being said is stabilization and de-ISIS, continuing de-ISIS, gives us sort of a military presence there. That military presence helps support a push towards negotiations, because it's one more thing that needs to be negotiated by all the players who sort of have a vote in how this end game happens. But in terms of the major lever for this is economic. Over time, the fact that the Syrian regime is bankrupt and that the Iranian and Russian sponsors cannot pay in perpetuity and cannot reconstruct, this is the real engine that pushes us to 2254 in Geneva. And then the diplomatic lever, which is Geir Peterson and the United Nations, firmly supported by almost everyone in the Gulf and in Europe, by the United States and by Turkey, ultimately will make the process work. Look, the Syrian people, I think, are ready for this. They're ready for some real compromises to be made. The biggest obstacle in my mind right now is the view of some in Damascus that they won this war and that they can simply march to victory and have the international community bless it. That's not going to happen because, as we discussed earlier, they haven't won. What they've done is, in a portion of this conflict, they've proven resilient enough in a military sense so that the opposition's not been able to displace them. That's a far cry from victory. It is a stalemate, and stalemates get solved through careful diplomacy. So again, the military is not entirely going away as one of the levers that gets us to resolution, but it's going to have to be economics and the international diplomatic push behind Geir Peterson that really get us there.
And in regards to European allies, they are interested in stabilization, but are they interested in to basically contribute for the reconstruction as well? So
I think there's broad consensus, not total, but broad consensus that Europe will play a major role in reconstruction when the time is right. The time is not right now because we're not going to reward Assad and legitimize Assad through this process. But yeah, from everything that I hear, Europe, and as well as multilateral institutions in which Europe plays a major role, understand that there will be a sort of an opportunity and maybe a responsibility to help with that when the time comes. I don't think this is going to be a conflict in which people say, oh, it's too expensive, it's too hard, it's too distant. Syria is close enough and has touched Europe through the 6 or 7 years of conflict deeply enough that they want to play a role in making sure that it's put together in the right way, put back together in the right way. But that right way, just to hit it one more time, is not going to be under an unrecalcitrant, unrepentant, unreconstructed regime of Assad.
Okay. And Professor Duran, about the safe zone, what are Turkey's priorities? Turkey mentioned this a couple of times, but do you think after these negotiations, anything changed about the Turkey's position in regards to safe zone?
Well, Turkey's first priority is, of course, is to clear YPG from the borders. And, you know, this may be considered by the US officials, supporting YPG, as tactical, temporary, and transactional. But this has created a big problem for Turkey. You know, even this is creating more tensions between Washington and Ankara in political and strategic terms, not in temporary terms. So Turkey is calling for a U.S. to reconsider supporting arming YPG because of this reality. You know, PKK's branch YPG is, you know, not just pro-Kurdish but also ethnically based terrorist organization which aimed at Turkey's national unity, disrupting Turkish national unity. So this is the first priority for Turkey. Another one is about safe return of refugees to Syrian lands. Yes, Turkey is hosting 3.6 million Syrian people in Turkey, but you know, this is a very difficult job. As we all know, not just in Europe, in the US, but also all over the world, there's xenophobia and anti-immigration sentiments is on the rise. So it is the same with Turkey. Maybe thanks to President Erdogan's strong leadership that Turkey can suppress this kind of feelings in Turkey for a period. But you know, you cannot continue with that. You have to solve a problem. So that's why a safe zone is very critical for Turkey to make refugees go back to their lands. And of course, political solution is very critical. And that's why Turkey is very open to merge Astana process with the Geneva process and to work with US and Europe to make it possible a political solution working. But you know, for the safe zone issue, YPG's presence is very critical. As far as I understood, there should be some, you know, President Trump declared that 20 miles from the border. Maybe this is the point we start to discuss the future of YPG. But in the long run, Turkey cannot accept any threat to its unity, national unity, stemming from YPG. This issue has to be solved while negotiating with the US. In any way, in the medium or long term, Turkey cannot accept this threat to its unity. 20 to 54 is a background for all of us, including Europe and US and Turkey, to work on this. As far as I know, there are discussions on the how to handle this YPG. Is it possible to separate lower echelons from upper echelons? You know, these are the issues, how to separate them. But, you know, this is an issue of negotiation between Turkey and US.
Before I skip more questions, let me get a few questions from the audience. Let's start with Bassam.
Thank you, SETA, for having this panel. Rich, you mentioned that the Syrian people are willing to accept some concession. What kind of concession, and who are the Syrian people you are talking about? Dr. Duran, how are you? Do you think Turkey had the right to tell the Syrian people where to go, the Syrian refugee in Turkey, where to go and when? For example, if the Syrian refugee in Turkey, they want to come back to Raqqa, Hasaka, Deir ez-Zor today. You have something like 300,000 refugees from that part. If they want to come back today to their areas, do you think Turkey would say, no, you cannot go back because this under PYD, PKK control? Or you say it's not our business, go away? Thank you.
Barbara, let me collect some questions.
Thank you very much, SETA, for doing this. Barbara Slavin from the Atlantic Council. To Rich, you spoke about one of the goals to reduce the Iranian presence in Syria. What are your estimates of IRGC and Iran-backed militias now in Syria? Do you see any diminution in that presence, given that most of the major fighting is over? And has the recent designation of the IRGC as a foreign terrorist organization complicated this process as far as you're concerned, or made it more difficult to prevent conflict, inadvertent or otherwise, between U.S. and Iranian forces in Syria? Thank you.
Thank you. Rich.
Okay, great. Thank you for both those. So, Bassam, I'm not sure if you misheard or I misspoke, but I was not saying that the Syrian people are ready to make concessions. I think the Syrian people are ready to see concessions from the regime in Damascus, because it's probably my fault. So, but I think the regime has not made concessions. Every time it has had the opportunity from 2011 onward to make what any responsible government would do in terms of concessions to its people, to their rights to protest, to their rights for reasonable services, to their rights for inclusive governance, and to their rights to safety and security in their homes, the answer has been barrel bombs, gas, oppression, and murders in Sednaya. So I think what I'm saying is that the pressure will build on the regime and on its supporters and financiers, because as they expect that they will have a simple military victory crowned by international recognition, legitimization, and money, none of that will come. And what they will have instead will be a broken country upon which pressure will grow and grow and grow until they make those concessions. And what I meant to say is the Syrian people have suffered enough, and it's a shame that is shared by the international community that we have not had a more forceful response to help bring that suffering to an end. The only thing that can really make that end in a way that's going to be acceptable is for the government in Damascus, if I can use that term, to start making some of those concessions that should have been made a long time ago. And if I can answer Barbara's question as well, I can't get into, even if I did remember them, I think it's probably classified in terms of estimates of total number of IRGC or related militias there. What I feel comfortable saying is I've seen no evidence of a substantial reduction in that. Instead, what we've seen is sort of the model that you see in other countries where the IRGC is active, which is linked businesses and militias and sort of social institutions and housing units and things like that popping up all over. And we've heard many reports from Syria about outreach to try to change even the sectarian nature of some of the communities. It's as if there is an archipelago of sort of Iranian-focused communities and institutions being built in certain parts of the country. So it looks to me like they're there for the long term and that they're trying to essentially turn large parts of Syria into what they've done in southern Lebanon.
Burhanettin, Duran.
Well, Bassam, you're right. No one has the right to tell Syrian people where to go. The ideal solution is to let them to live wherever they were living before the civil war. But for, of course, for Turkey to make a safe zone on the borders will allow people to go their lands, to their even at least their homeland, Syria, and this will make it easy. Maybe just the beginning of this process, transition process, to make it possible to live in their countries. Of course, this is not Deir ez-Zor, this is not Raqqa. Hama, Humus, many places, many Syrian refugees came to Turkey from every part of Syria. The ideal solution is to have political solution, and after that they will go their country. So, but we have to make a step forward. This is just one step forward to have a safe zone. If Turkey and US can make it, this would be a positive step and not the final one.
Thank you. Let's get this gentleman over here and that gentleman.
Thank you. Karwan Zabari with the KRG. Two-part question, one for Professor Duran and one for Richard. Professor Duran, you mentioned that the priority number one for Turkey is the YPG. Let's take that further and ask you this question. Don't you think Turkey's concerns with YPG stem from internal Kurdish problem inside Turkey, where if Turkey was to go back to peace process, would that resolve these perceived security concerns inside Syria? And then Richard, according to the professor, Turkey's security concerns, priority number one is YPG. U.S. security concern, priority number one is ISIS, Hayat Tahrir Sham, other militant groups. Tell me where this convergence takes place when these two priorities differ quite a bit, whereas ISIS for Turkey is down the line, and for the United States, it's top list number one. Thanks.
Okay, let me get the last question from the gentleman over there. Yes.
Hi, thanks so much. Brian Harris with Al Monitor. I want to ask Richard about two elephants in the room. With regards to the YPG, they're currently in talks with Damascus to reach some sort of agreement. In which case, if that goes through, what's Plan B for the U.S. if this safe zone idea fails and you're unable to reach some sort of compromise with Turkey and the YPG? And also Idlib, the ceasefire there, the Assad regime, keeps saying that Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is controlling a lot of the area, therefore Turkey isn't fulfilling its responsibilities, and that seems like it could jeopardize the Idlib ceasefire. So does the U.S. need to be more involved in the Astana process, or would that be counterproductive? Thank you.
Thank you. Barbara, did you want to follow up? I can make it 2.5 questions.
Rich, you didn't answer the question about the FTO designation. I mean, we're talking about can the U.S. negotiate and sit alongside Iran? How can we do that when we just said their military is a terror organization?
Thank you, Rich.
So it was. I was trying to be diplomatic, Barbara.
He heard your question.
I did hear the question. It's a little beyond my remit in terms of analyzing second and third order effects of that. I have heard lots of concern from people, mostly though about second and third order effects on U.S. military folks overseas and about the legal complications that come once we start designating one another's state-linked organizations. Look, at a certain level, I will tell you I'm a big fan of the decision because IRGC, I was in Iraq, I was in a number of other places. I have no doubt about the nature of that group and the things that they do. And it's satisfying to see a correct diagnosis of the problem. In the medical field, which my wife works in, there's both diagnosis and then there's prescription. I'm not sure about the prescription, to be honest with you. I think it's good to have a maximum number of tools possible, to both in potential and in actual application, to put pressure where pressure needs to be put. So I think time will tell if some of the real concerns about that. But I'll just speculate here a little bit. I don't think there's any possibility that we were going to somehow deal in a non-coercive manner on IRGC. We're not going to negotiate the IRGC out of there, given the role that they're playing. It's going to have to be sticks and not carrots, I think, that gets the IRGC out. So to that extent, you're asking me if having another stick is a bad thing, I'm going to say no. But that said, a lot matters on how the applications. I'd be more worried about second and third order effects than on the specific impact on the Syrian part. Now, on the KRG question, great question. And I think what came to mind when you asked the question is that this is really a question of windows, both on the case of Idlib and on the case of Safe Zone. I have been of the impression that the outreach from YPG and linked groups to Damascus has not gone well for a couple of different reasons. And I think that, looking at it from the perspective of that organization and its the folks that it works with, there's not a lot of good options out there. I think that the regime is threatened by YPG/STC, SDF strength in that area. The regime is no fonder of the YPG than Turkey is, really, at the end of the day. So the outreach to try to say, make a deal that legitimizes or recognizes the gains that we've made, that's not going to sell in Damascus. So at the same time, at such point as that group comes to the conclusion that Damascus is less of a threat than Turkey, which it would be a failure of diplomacy and a failure of the safe zone, that may be an option that they pursue. So that's a window that could close. The rest of the question as it regards YPG being Turkey's #1 perceived terror threat and security threat, and for us, ISIS and HTS and others being true insofar as it goes. But this is also a symptom. The actual problem is that when you have a vacuum of legitimate state authority, which absolutely pertains right now, and when you do not have consensus-based interim organizations, then lots of radical groups will kick up and will become opportunistically, like an opportunistic infection, will sort of take the place of that. So I think we're never going to convince Turkey that they should worry primarily about ISIS and secondarily about YPG. They are also probably never going to convince us that we should do the reverse. What we can both agree on, and which I think we have agreed on, is that there should be, until 2254 gets a reasonable, legitimate state authority back in that area, that we need inclusive governance and security, I won't say institutions because, again, these are all going to feed back into the Syrian state at some point, arrangements. And by the way, we've had very good conversations with Kurds of northeast Syria that are not part of YPG, from ENKS, YPG, Yakiti, sorry, not YPG, the KNC, Yakiti, and other. There are many Kurds who want different and more inclusive arrangements. There are many Arabs who want different and more inclusive arrangements. And by the way, this doesn't mean an outright rejection of the people who heretofore have supported YPG, SDC, SDF. Even many of my Turkish friends acknowledge that some of the people who have either fought for YPG or politically supported that movement have done so from a lack of other alternatives. Because in a wartime environment, and especially when you have ISIS cutting heads the next village over or in that village, people go to whatever their option is that's non-ISIS. So we have to remember when we're talking about how Turkey and the United States got to these different prioritizations, it's all the function of an extremely dangerous, polarized, unsafe environment. First, you remove the source of that and get some sort of reasonably pluralistic working arrangements there, and then the prioritization, I think, will start to even out a little bit. And then the last part was on Idlib. Look, we think the locus of problem solving is Geneva, not Astana. Our Turkish friends have a slightly different view, and I won't speak for them except for to say it's a pragmatic view. Their pragmatic view has been someone should talk to the Iranians and to the Russians. We don't want to solve our problems in Astana. Astana was established to be a ceasefire mechanism that would feed back into the broader negotiations in Geneva. And frankly, most of the ceasefires it's put together haven't worked either. The one in Idlib has worked okay. I don't think anybody, with possible exception of the Assad regime, wants Idlib to blow up right now. Nobody's exceptionally happy with how the ceasefire is going. We're all very concerned with the continuing threat of radical terror groups emanating out of Idlib. And I think Turkey has a patient, and we'll see if it's ultimately efficacious or not, approach to stabilizing Idlib. But I do not think it's realistic to expect the United States to jump in through Astana to become more of a player in Idlib. This is something where I think we're simply going to have to work to encourage our friends in Ankara to continue playing a constructive role and perhaps to lead the way to a solution on Idlib.
Thank you. Burhanettin?
Well, is YPG related to internal problems of Turkey? Well, PKK is the umbrella of the groups. YPG is one of them. And this PKK is aiming at pan-Kurdish territory to carve out a pan-Kurdish territory from 4 countries, including Turkey. So this is the problem of ethnically separatist terrorist organization. Of course, Turkey has some millions of Kurds, and Turkey has tried to solve this problem by the application of a resolution process 2 times. The last one failed because of PKK's awareness that I can take some support even from the superpower of the world, the US, to arm itself. So it's no need, there is no need to continue with the resolution process. That's why PKK resorted to violence and terrorism within Turkey, and Turkey is fighting with this PKK in the last 3 years with a political will, with a determined political will. So, we know that ethnic separatist movements are not declining their demands of territory from Spain and other ethnic nationalist groups. In such an environment, for Turkey, two neighbors in civil war, there is a very big danger of disunity, partition of Syria and Iraq, and at the same time, this means a very real threat, valid threat to Turkish unity. So within such an environment, is it possible to restart resolution process again? I don't think so, because Turkey did this activity 2 times, and there is no suitable environment to deal with this issue in political terms. If we consider Kurds' rights in Turkey, all of them are fulfilled within the democratization process, with the exception of any claim to autonomy. But any kind of autonomy, acceptance of any autonomy will not work. We have seen this in Europe, even such a peaceful environment. If you consider this in the middle of Syria and Iraq, in the middle of such a turbulent region, this will be a very dangerous failed attempt. So there is no need to do again.
Thank you very much. And at this point, we are 3 minutes behind the schedule, actually. Thank you for joining us, and please join me thanking our panelists.